Welcome back to Scruffy Tales and to another video where I play the Armchair General. Right, so first off, let's take a look at the bigger picture, what's going on down in Ukraine before we move on to a bit more up-close details. Right, so up north, northern front marked in red, this is where Russia has been trying to be a bit sneaky and outmaneuver Ukraine by launching their own offensive, as Ukraine was launching their offensive in the south. And they haven't really had any successes up there, thank God. It was a bit touch and go there for a moment, but Ukraine managed to hold the line. Moving on, we got the central front with Bakhmut and Avdiivka. Battles that are more about trying to force the enemy to allocate troops to the area so they're not able to fight at the north or in the south. Southern front, marked in blue, is where Ukraine launched their main offensive a couple of months back, and where they have been trying to breach the Russian defensive lines in order to push on south to the coast. Western front is where Ukraine were a bit sneaky and managed to cross the Dnieper River to cause a lot of headaches for the Russians, forcing Russia to allocate troops to this part of the front line, and so they can't send all troops, all tanks, all artillery up to the southern front. They have to keep them down here, just in case Ukraine tries to establish a proper bridgehead. And of course, then we have Crimea, the Crimean front, where Ukraine has really stepped things up. It started out with sabotage against supplies and the odd partisan attack against Russian troops, and then they started hitting the vital Kerch Bridge, the only road connection between Russia proper and Crimea. And then they stepped it up with starting to send in missiles towards Russian generals and what have you. And now, of late, they obviously have been sending in drones and missiles to specifically target the Russian Navy operating out of Crimea. So Crimea has evolved into a front line of its own, in its own right. Okay, now we've established the various parts of the front line where the most important fighting is going on. We will now start to take a closer look at each section of the front. I'm going to start off with the northern front, an operation that I'm calling the Russian Gambit. And we're going to cover it briefly since the Russians haven't really managed anything and not that much has happened on the map, to be honest. What is the point of this attack? Well, the Russians were hoping to exploit the Ukrainian offensive to launch their own offensive, a counteroffensive to the counteroffensive. There's a number of reasons why they did this up north. It's further away from the Ukrainian main force. It's shorter logistical routes for Russia, and Russia can build up manpower and logistics and resources inside of Russia, where Ukraine is not allowed to use Western weapons and stuff to hit them with artillery and missiles and what have you. So it made all the sense in the world for Russia to prepare for an offensive up here in the north. And what they hope to achieve up here is to break through towards Borova and expand from Borova, it's the town in the middle here, so right in the middle of the map, expand north from Borova and south to link up with the forces that are pushing in on the flanks, as you can see here. With the goal to secure all terrain east of the Oskil River, marked in blue, that's a river and a large lake or reservoir right next to Borova. And this is actually a pretty huge chunk of Ukraine that they could potentially grab if they play their cards right. But so far they have had very little gains. But it's not like they haven't tried. Reports from especially up north, close to Kupiansk, and even in the south, the red arrow to the south here. The reports are indicating continuous attacks. I mean, wave upon wave. They just won't let down. So they are really trying to break through the Ukrainian defenses here. And truth be told, Russia actually almost managed to break through the Ukrainian lines in the center. There's a main road leading from, or a highway leading from Svatove to Borova. And this is where Russia went all in. Was it a month ago, I think? Almost succeeding in a blitzkrieg fashion assault, where they pushed in, forced Ukraine back, tried to get up on a huge ridge line that is located in the middle of the map here. And had they managed to take that ridge line, then they would have had an open road, as it were, straight to Borova, which would have allowed them to initiate the next steps of this operation in fanning out and trying to link up with the friendly forces in the north and south. But Ukraine got their shit together and rearranged their troops, rearranged the lines, and held the ridge line. And then they have, piece by piece, pushed Russia back towards Svatove. Russia is still trying to push in the middle. You can't deny that, but they failed in this blitzkrieg-style assault in the center of the northern front. I think it's also interesting that Ukraine provided us with numbers of what they thought they were facing up here in this part of the front line. And according to Ukraine, Russia amassed some 100,000 troops in this area, together with 900 armored vehicles, 500 artillery pieces, and 500 various rocket systems. We should point out that no, it's not 100,000 fighting men. The 100,000 more than likely includes everyone, maintenance crews, truck drivers for the logistics, cooks and dentists and officers and their staff and so forth. So the number of fighting men, probably somewhere around 30,000 maybe. At a stretch, 40,000. A couple of months back when Russia began this counter move to the Ukrainian offensive in the south. And like I said, the Russian gambit was to try and lock Ukraine in place in the south, as that was the most likely place for Ukraine to launch their counteroffensive, and Russia probably had intel on Ukraine massing troops down in the south as well. So they realized that was where the main attack was going to happen. So they intended to lock the Ukrainians in place and then do the gambit by launching an offensive of their own in the north. So far, it appears as if this gambit has failed. They haven't really made any gainway at all. And Ukraine is doing one hell of a job in holding the Russians back up in the north. Jumping way over to the western front, briefly here, where we have commander raids. Ukraine has crossed the Dnieper river and begun harassing Russian positions, and have done so for weeks and weeks. Russia has failed to dislodge Ukraine from these, by now, two main footholds. They went all in when Ukraine first secured the Antonov Bridge in the middle of the satellite image here. They sent in vehicles, infantry, they even bombed it with missiles and what have you. That was not enough. The Ukrainians managed to hold on to their positions and have now slowly expanded their influence on in Russian occupied territory to the south of Kherson. We have had reports of further Ukrainian incursions to the east and west. Nothing indicated on the maps as far as I know. So those have probably been raids, or they tried to establish a foothold and Russia probably pushed them back. From what I can gather, these Ukrainian troops have relied on British training and British tactics, Royal Commandos and stuff like that. Probably even British Special Boat Service, a sister organization to, or sister regiment, I should say, to the more famous SAS. So SAS is Army, SBS is Navy, as far as I can remember. So their SBS is basically SAS, but they use boats instead of jumping out of aircraft. So badass motherfuckers, just as the SAS. And as I understand it, Royal Commandos and probably operators from the SBS have trained the Ukrainians in small unit tactics in a water environment, fighting on islands and securing shorelines and moving across waters and stuff like that. So what is the point of all this, since they aren't really pushing hard into the Russian lines here? Well, it's difficult to get troops across a river, especially a river that is covered by the enemy. So what they are doing is getting across to harass primarily at the moment Russian positions with raids and commando strikes, and they gather intelligence for the artillery and missiles, so they can rely on indirect fire to fight the Russians occupying the territory south of Kherson. And what this means is Ukraine is, without moving in heavy equipment, they are actually still forcing Russia to allocate troops and equipment and resources to the Western Front, just because Russia has to. They don't know if this is Ukraine probing to get infantry across, probing to get tanks across. And since Ukraine has managed to establish 2 footholds, that could expand. They could use that to expand their influence and create proper bridgehead in order to get troops across the river. So Russia has to move troops to the Western Front to prevent that from happening, or just in case that happens. Troops and resources that they could have used on the Southern Front instead, for instance. And the reason is, of course, if Ukraine manages to get infantry and armor across the river, they are in a position to push down towards Crimea. And if they pull that off, if they can cut off Crimea from the rest of the front line, they have cut off one of Russia's most important routes to move in supplies to the front line. And it's basically cutting off extremely vital logistical routes, meaning Russia ends up being unable to hold on to primarily the Western Front, and at the end of it, potentially even the Southern Front. So this is why Russia is forced to have a powerful presence on the Western Front, despite them only fighting small units of commandos, basically. All right, so we jump back to the east, to the Central Front. Diversions and propaganda, because here we have 2 main battles, the battle for Bakhmut and the battle for Avdiivka. Bakhmut is held by Russia, Avdiivka is held by Ukraine. And as you can see, Avdiivka located in the south, and Bakhmut, it's not. It's written out on a map, but it's the red circle to the north. Now, these two battles mean nothing for the overall war effort as far as in gaining control of territory. The battle serves a purpose as diversions. They're meant to draw resources away from the more important locations, the more important battles, forcing the enemy to waste manpower and equipment at these locations. So Russia doesn't want to lose Bakhmut. So since Ukraine is applying pressure on Bakhmut, Russia must send in troops to hold Bakhmut, because Russia does not want to lose Bakhmut. Even if Bakhmut itself is pointless, they can't lose it because it's so important to them politically and for propaganda purposes. And Avdiivka, Ukraine is holding it because they obviously don't want to lose territory. That would be bad for propaganda as well. So Russia is applying pressure on Avdiivka to take that town, or potentially take that town, forcing Ukraine to send in troops to hold that town. Troops they could have used on the southern front, or troops they could have used up at Bakhmut, for instance. So that's what's going on here on the central front. If Russia takes Avdiivka, it changes nothing. As you can see, Russia is already in control of the main highway that leads north. What they should do is push north along that highway, in that case, to try and help out at Bakhmut. They're not doing that because, this battle here, this section of the front line is not important. What is important is the northern front and the southern front. So they're just applying pressure at these 2 points, Bakhmut and Avdiivka, to force the other side to send in troops that are needed elsewhere. For the last month or two, Ukraine has had some notable successes, to be honest. South of Bakhmut, around the town of Klishivka, Russia pushed back into Klishivka, Ukraine went after it, and what have you. And since Ukraine, and they also secured some hills outside of Bakhmut. So all in all, what this does is puts pressure on Russian high command, because, like I said, Bakhmut has immense political value to Russia, and it is vital for Russian propaganda. So Russia can't afford to lose the city, and the reason is they spent, 6 months trying to take Bakhmut, and they lost tens of thousands of soldiers trying to take the city, and they lost thousands of vehicles. I mean, it was a slaughter. And it was the only real victory Russia had during their own offensive spanning the winter and spring of 2023. So to lose Bakhmut, I mean, that would really be an indication that Russia is losing the war, right? They managed only this one big victory at the beginning of the year, or the first half of the year, and then to lose it in a month or two, that's not going to happen. That would be catastrophic for Russian propaganda and the Russian narrative. So they will do what they can to hold Bakhmut. And now Ukraine, they've taken the high ground, or some of the high ground, and they're beginning to take the towns south of Bakhmut. And this provides a problem for Russia, because Russia wants to put in troops on the northern front. They want to send in troops to the southern front. But now they're forced, for political reasons, for propaganda reasons, to allocate valuable resources into holding Bakhmut. And they've already moved troops from the northern front down to Bakhmut, for instance. Hell, they've even moved troops from the northern front to the southern front. But this is what's going on here. And we're going to zoom in a bit on Bakhmut to explain why this battle isn't really worth it for Ukraine. besides just forcing Russia to send in more troops to die. Right, so Ukraine is having success south of Bakhmut, and most recently pushing into the town of Avdiivka, not to be confused with the town of Avdiivka, the other battle where Russia is trying to take a town from Ukraine. So Ukraine have taken Avdiivka and they have pushed into Klishivka, as I understand it, in the last couple of days. And so they're having successes south of Bakhmut. They are slowly pushing eastward, town by town, or town by town. They have taken the big hill to the west of Klishivka, and they've taken Klishivka, and they've taken Avdiivka. So they're taking 2 towns and a hill in 3 months' time. So that should tell you something about the intensity of Russian defenses in the area. Liberating this area, as take a look at between Bakhmut and the Russian main defenses. Liberating this area will be time-consuming and costly in terms of lives and resources. I mean, you can see all the towns and villages, and each town, each village is an excellent position for Russia to defend. I mean, you have every concrete building is a bunker, and ordinary buildings are defensive positions, and you have ditches, and you have sewers, and you have all these things that can be used to hide explosives or troops with anti-tank weapons or what have you. So, and we also know that there are several hills in the area between Bakhmut and the main defensive line here, where Russia can set up artillery, they can set up anti-tank guided missiles, where tanks can find good overwatch position, and so on. And I mean, remember the cost of lives and equipment it took for Russia to take Bakhmut. I mean, it would be the same for Ukraine if they were to assault and try and liberate Bakhmut. It would be insanely costly, and maybe even to a degree that they can't push on to take Soledar or move further east to Klinove, or even to reach the main defensive line. So that is why, I mean, taking Bakhmut for Ukraine will achieve basically nothing that has military worth. It will drain reserves of manpower, resources, equipment, and vehicles. That's all that will achieve. And Bakhmut is only the first obstacle. It's a major obstacle, but it's only the first step towards reaching the main defensive line. They still have Soledar, they still have Zaitseve, Opytne, Klinove, and they still have to cross the rivers. They still have to take these small Russian outposts in the middle here before they can reach the main defensive line to be able to threaten Popasna eventually. And to do that, they must first clear out Bakhmut and lose thousands of troops. And then they have to move on to the next town, and the next town, and the next trench line, and then walk into one ambush, and the next ambush, and so on, and so on, and so on. That is why this has no military significance for Ukraine. They will gain nothing by launching an all-out assault in this area, except for drawing in Russian reinforcements. So Ukraine will apply pressure here, significant pressure, as we've seen them doing in the south of Bakhmut, and that will force Russia to allocate resources and manpower to hold Bakhmut, because Bakhmut is far more important to Russia than what it is for Ukraine. So that's what's going on at Bakhmut, and to a lesser degree down at Avdiivka to the south. All right, moving on to the southern front, the grind. Minefields have effectively reduced the speed of the offensive. This is where Ukraine went all in hopes of punching through the Russian defenses, and they aimed for 2 points in particular, and were slowed down specifically over at Velika Novoselka by the extensive minefields. Had more success eventually at Orikhiv, south of Orikhiv. But the reason why this is going slow is because of the minefields. Make no mistake about it, that is the only reason that Ukraine have been slowed down the way they have. These minefields, they just go on and on for miles on end, and they are deep, and there's like 50 mines placed in an area of 10 square meters or something. It's just an insane amount of mines that Russia has put down. And for good reason. Russia knew that this was happening. They knew that Ukraine would be coming in with tanks, with armor, with Western equipment, so they prepared for that. And they made sure that everything between the front line and the main defensive line was mined to the brim, right? So the ground was overflowing with mines, because that's basically the most effective way to slow down armor. Western doctrine is really simple. If you realize you're in a minefield, you back away, and then you try and find the edge and go around it, right? That is Western doctrine. You try and find the edge of the minefield, and then you're prepared for, okay, this is a bottleneck, this is where they're going to try and hit us, this is where the fight is. Russia didn't do that. Well, they did that to an extent, but mainly this was like no end to it. That was the main thing. Ukraine hit a minefield, tried to go around it, and it was like, there's no end to it. There is no bottleneck. And obviously, if you try to push in with tanks and combat vehicles, and there is no bottleneck, there's only an endless stretch of mines, what are you going to do? You are obviously slowed down. And then once you do find the bottleneck, Russia has aimed every gun on the planet at that bottleneck. You are in for one hell of a fight. So no wonder then that this has gone as slow as it has, right? And this has nothing to do with air superiority or anything like that. This is all about the minefields. And Ukraine, and not only that, once Ukraine find a bottleneck and manage to push through, then Russia obviously knows here's the bottleneck, or they know that, oh, they tried to blow their way through the minefields over there. It's kind of obvious and easy to adjust to those conditions, and Russia just piles in troops to counterattack when Ukraine tries to make a move. So this has been the dance back and forth. Ukraine finds a hole in the minefields, or they create one. Russia are obviously prepared. Ukraine moves through. Russia counterattacks in an hope to overwhelm the Ukrainian spearhead, the Ukrainian vanguard, and forces Ukraine to fall back. And this is, well, it's kind of new. It's kind of new because no one has seen minefields like this ever. I made a point about it in, I believe, in a Swedish video of mine, that this is kind of like World War I. At the start of that conflict, armies maneuvered, they moved, they made great gains. Germany pushed into Belgium and they pushed into France. You know, it was, you know, big armies moving aggressively to force the enemy to react. And then people started digging trenches. And all of a sudden, no general was prepared that there would be trenches going straight across the continent. And all of a sudden you had these big armies, and they were like, what? We can't move? There's no way we can maneuver? No, because we got machine guns and artillery. We're stuck here. And this The southern frontier of the Ukrainian war is the modern equivalent. You had maneuver armies ready to move in, and then they ran into something that they weren't prepared for. An endless line, an endless field of mines going straight across the country. And they were like, what can we do? You can't do anything. You have to slowly advance to try and avoid artillery, to try and avoid anti-tank missiles, and find a weak spot and then do your best and punch through. So this is very much a modern version of World War I, where the big maneuvering armies found themselves going up against an obstacle that no one had predicted. So what did Ukraine do to counter this? Well, they didn't want to lose every tank they had in a handful of engagements as they tried to move into the bottlenecks and then go down in a blaze of glory against every Russian gun ever made, which is quite literally true at this point, I think. So they instead started, okay, we need to make sure we commit when we have an actual weak spot, right? So you just because there's a bottleneck, we can't just go all in. We go in with small units, a platoon, and we basically do a recon by fire. What is the Russian response? If Russia responds in full, then we lose a platoon and not a company. If Russia isn't prepared for this assault, well, then we have a platoon in place and we move in the company to support that platoon. So that is what's going on, as far as I can figure it, anyway. And so that's why things are going so slow. No one was prepared for these extensive minefields, and Ukraine had to adapt to it. Again, has nothing to do with air power, has nothing to do with air superiority. Russia has air superiority, or had rather, and that has not helped them one bit this year, right? So no, that's not part of the equation. Well, it is, but not to the extent that the internet would like it to be, right? Anyway, we're going to be going over the two main points of assault here from Velika Novosilka and Orkiv, and go into what's going on at either location. Starting off with the Velika Novosilka operation, indicated by the box on the map, and it's the push towards the Azov Sea. There's a highway here leading straight from Novosilka straight down to slightly to the west of Mariupol and to the shoreline, to the coast. So that is the highway that Ukraine wants. And the plan was, before anyone knew of the minefields, to push in a couple of weeks, push Russia back and reach the main defensive line. And that is when I guess Ukraine thought that is where the main fight is going to be. Push on through the main defensive line, start fanning out, and blitzkrieg in blitzkrieg fashion, start surrounding section of the front line, and then with a thunder run, follow the highway as far south as possible without overextending, and by so doing have troops deep behind Russian lines, forcing Russia to respond to this situation and have them fall back in full. Obviously, this did not happen because of all the minefields. So what happened was that Ukraine got stuck at the town of Staromayorsk early on, and then it took them over a month to get into that town itself. And they did not do, I thought they were going to do a head-on assault. Actually, I made a video about this a couple of months back, before they even went into Staromayorsk. And I thought they would do the head-on assault because I thought they would avoid the big open fields, the big open farmlands where they would be easy targets. What happened was that Ukraine avoided the frontal assault and instead actually went out on the flanks into the farmlands, into the fields, and fought Russia there. and they mainly attacked to the west of Staromayorsk. There's a big hill there that they wanted, that gave them overwatch and fire control, as people now like to say, over the Staromayorsk and the roads leading into Staromayorsk. So it took Ukraine a little bit more than a month to push up on this big hill that gave them the ability to fire directly into the town from the high ground and then launch an assault with vehicles, as far as I can tell, into the town itself and push Russia out of Staromayorsk. And having achieved that, they also managed to take a small village right next to Staromayorsk called Urushaine. And Staromayorsk and Urushaine both control this main highway I was talking about leading south. That's why they needed these two towns. But now they are focusing on securing the territory east and west of Staromayorsk and Urushaine, so they don't end up being outflanked on three sides. So they are trying to push Russia down to flatten the front line so they can then begin offensive maneuvers southward again. Now, as you can see here, we have this more than just Staromayorsk in this area. You have several towns and villages. As you can see, all the blue here, streams, rivers, lakes. And on top of that, the main Russian defensive line here in the area is located up on hills, up on high ground, to the west and east of the town of Novopetrivka. There's a couple of other towns more or less interconnected with the main town here, Novopetrivka. But the circles on the map, the brown yellow circles, they indicate the hills. So it's an uphill battle for Ukraine once they eventually reach Staromelivka and once they push in possibly east of Novopetrivka. There's a hill over there as well. East of Novopetrivka, but then they have to go into this small valley where the river is and then push uphill towards Russian defensive lines. So it's a tough fight. I mean, it took them this long to reach Staromayorsk, and now they have to somehow push down towards Staromelivka and then cross open terrain and fight uphill towards the Russian defenses. Plus, if they want the main highway, they have to go through Novopetrivka and the towns connected to that major settlement. And so what we're seeing is, at the moment, as I said, that Ukraine is trying to flatten the front line so they're not outflanked in Staromayorsk. They are doing this partially to flatten the front line, but also in order to gain control of the roads leading into this combat zone. The more roads you have, it will be more difficult for Russian artillery or Russian special forces to intercept logistics, ambulances, reinforcements, and stuff like that. So they want roads so they can send in, so they will have options in sending in reinforcements, options in moving in logistics, and options in moving the wounded out of the combat area. So that's what's going on here. They're flattening the front line, gaining control of the various roads in the area before they can make a move on Staromelivka and from there pushing south towards the main defensive line. And like I said, Ukraine's main goal has been from the start to secure the TO518 highway, since it leads all the way south to the Sea of Azov, slightly west of Mariupol. But in order to do this, they must secure Novopetrivka and the surrounding towns, but also breach the Russian trenches and claim the high ground in the area. And as you can see, the Russian defenses here around Novopetrivka, they are extensive. They are pretty well thought out. And they have, I mean, Ukraine have been trying to push south for 3 months, 4 months. That's a lot of time for Russian troops to improve on their defensive lines, to build more trenches, to plan better points where they can ambush or clear lanes of fire. I mean, a couple of months back there might have been trees in the way for their anti-tank missiles. Now they have probably have cut down several trees to deny Ukraine cover, but also give free lines of sight for anti-tank guided missile teams and so on. So this will be a tough nut to crack for Ukraine if they don't get help from breaching over at Robotino or Verbove. If they're left to only trying to push through here as it is, it's going to be a tough fight, and it's going to cost Ukraine a lot of manpower to achieve this, I'm afraid. All right, moving on to the Orikhiv operation and the push towards Tokmak. It appears as if the internet has very much agreed upon that Ukraine is trying to move towards Tokmak in this area. Tokmak is a vital logistical hub for Russia. It also has an important airfield to the north of the town that keeps helicopters and it keeps gunships, helicopters operational close to the front line, so they don't have to spend too much fuel as they fly out to conduct missions to hunt down Ukrainian armor. Why is Tokmak important besides being a logistical hub and having an airfield? Well, being a logistical hub means it's connected. A lot of roads reach Tokmak and go out from Tokmak, and that is important for Ukraine as well, because if you take Tokmak, well, then you can use those roads to spread out and attack Russia all across the south. More importantly, you can push on towards either Melitopol or head southeast towards a town of Berdyansk located right on the coastline. So Tokmak is important, absolutely. However, I'm not entirely convinced that Tokmak is what Ukraine is after, right now at least. So, to get to Tokmak, Ukraine has to fight through roughly 18 kilometers of towns, woods, hills, streams, lakes, and minefields. And Russian artillery, they have already prepared fire missions for every location. Ukraine is already reporting that this is an issue, that the moment they set up shop in a tree line or in a trench or on a hill or whatever, Russian artillery, they have already measured that distance a month ago. So that all they need is the location from the frontline troops, and the artillery adjusts correctly accordingly in just a couple of minutes and launch accurate fire with the first volleys. Sorry for that. And this will obviously continue to be a problem the closer Ukraine gets to Tokmak. The artillery will keep being very accurate throughout this push towards Tokmak. And Russian ambushes will be well thought out as well. They have had ample amount of time to plan how to lure Ukraine into ambushes, or to be prepared if Ukraine shows up over there. What can we do to prevent that? How can we call in mortars accurately? How can we have machine guns ready? How can we have anti-tank guns ready, and what have you? So they're going to have covering lanes of fire from tanks and anti-tank missiles, and they will be teamed up with machine guns and mortars every inch between the front line and Tokmak, right? So Ukraine will have to fight their way through towns and settlements, through bunkers and trenches, and gonna have to climb up on hills, and they have to fight their way downhill. They're gonna have to clear out tree lines and woods and what have you, and each inch of the way Russia will have prepared lanes of covering fire from every weapon system imaginable to deal with the Ukrainians as they advance south towards Tokmak. And it's been 3 months since Ukraine began this offensive. And I mean, that is 3 months that Russia has had time to prepare, to increase and improve on every aspect of their defenses in this region. And if Russia is prepared to defend Tokmak, then, I mean, just imagine what they have in store for Ukraine if Ukraine is trying to advance down towards Tokmak. So why attack Tokmak? Is that really the smartest move for Ukraine? It might be what they're planning to do. It just feels unnecessarily dangerous. Why take that risk if the goal is to punch through the main defensive line? Ukraine has, from the beginning, pushed towards southeast. They have not pushed south or southwest. They went for Robotyne, but overall the main push has been southeast. Now, if you take a look at the early stages of this massive push, it went straight towards Verbove. They were pushed back, but then they gained momentum again and started moving back towards Verbove. And now Ukraine is back on the outskirts of Verbove. So it seems Ukraine from early on wanted to head straight for Verbove. The fight for Robotyne is more than likely just to anchor, secure the flank. If they take Robotyne, well, if Russia wants to counterattack, they have to go through that hellish battle all over again, just like Ukraine did, to take Robotyne, to be able to threaten the flank. So Robotyne used to be a Russian fortress holding the front. It's now a Ukrainian fortress holding the flank, as Ukraine is pushing deeper into the Russian defenses. So why is Verbove important? Well, if Ukraine gets through the trenches and into the town and manages to take control of Verbove in a week, in a month, who knows, then Ukraine is basically almost through the Russian defenses. Because Verbove, the last buildings of Verbove, is basically right on top of the last line of defense of this massive Russian defensive line. And going through Verbove, that's 10 kilometers. Remember, reaching Tokmak, that's 18 kilometers. Going through Verbove, that's 10 kilometers. Or going through Verbove and even going through the defensive line and breaking through, that's 10 kilometers. It's much shorter distance with nowhere near the amount of obstacles that Ukraine would need to face in order to reach Tokmak. And if you zoom in on Verbove itself, I mean, if you look at the the various maps detailing the war, Verbove is a big, gray, dark area. But if you zoom in on Google Maps, it's not that large of a town. I mean, it has one main street right next to a small stream, and there's a lake. And this is the town. It's following one street, and then you have residential buildings all around it, probably stores and what have you as well. But this is the fight. This is where Ukraine has to go in and fight their way through this one street. I mean, yes, it's still dangerous. I mean, they have hills to the north, hills to the south, and trenches to the north and south. And the town itself is obviously built or has obviously been modified by Russia to be part of the overall defensive line, the overall defensive structure. But it's still this one street. It's not street to street fighting. They don't have to secure one city block and then move into the next and rely on tanks and what have you to cover intersections and stuff like that, or be worried about enemies up on high-rise buildings and stuff like this. This is a small town where you're going to be fighting building to building. Right? You're going to follow one street, building to building. And once you've done that, you are basically almost through the Russian defensive lines. Now compare that to trying to reach Tokmak, going a straight line from Robotyne. It's not going to be this easy. Easy is the wrong word, but you know, Verbove feels like the less difficult option. Now, there's obviously going to be problems here. You're going to be following one street, following a very narrow lane of attack. So if Russia calls in artillery, it's going to be kind of easy to target Ukrainians. But that goes in reverse as well. Ukrainian artillery is going to have a pretty easy time attacking Russian troops defending Verbove. And yes, Russia will have troops to north and south in the trench lines, but if Ukraine reaches the outskirts of Verbove, they can start making their way uphill, especially to the north of Verbove, and try and clear out those trench lines and so on. And if you push into Verbove, as you can see on the smaller map here, then you can actually move into the trench lines to the south and enter those and start clearing those out. Sorry. Difficulty speaking today, and you know, start opening up the Russian defenses overall. And you do that all by taking this one very small town. So why would you go straight at Tokmak when you can go through, bypass all the defenses simply by taking this one small town? Told you that would be an Armchair General video. God damn. Right, so to illustrate my point, if they push into Verbove, that's 10 kilometers roughly of hard fighting instead of 18 to reach Tokmak. And then they are through, right? If Ukraine secures Verbove and breaches the Russian defensive lines behind it, then Ukraine can push through up on the highlands to the southeast, because southeast of Verbove you have a large area of high ground, of highlands, spreading out over the south. And if they can get up there, they can begin maneuver warfare out on the farmlands, where Russia has no minefields that we know of. Why would they have extensive minefields that far behind their own lines, right? So go through Verbove, go through the defensive lines and spread out with armor and tanks and combat vehicles and begin maneuver warfare and outmaneuver the Russians. And then they can get up on the high ground, up on the highlands, and they can move on a town called Chernivka. It's the small circle to the south. That town, slightly to the east of that town, you have a big railway hub that can be used for logistical purposes for Ukraine, and also by controlling it, you deny Russia using it. Ukraine could obviously advance towards Tokmak by swinging down south and then west, and do this without fighting their way through bunkers and trench lines. Right? All they need to do is take Verbove and one more trench line, and then they're through, instead of taking 5 trench lines before they reach Tokmak. And they could even begin to surround and isolate Polowy. That's the city marked at the top of the picture here with a red circle. And that city, it's a rather large city, but it also has a huge railroad hub right smack in the middle of the city. And if Ukraine could isolate and surround Polowy and force Russia to fall back from it, abandon it, then they have access to this massive railroad hub, and that could help Ukraine very much logistically by bringing in troops and equipment and vehicles and what have you via the railroad system, and also by moving damaged equipment out from the front line back to the rear where it can be repaired, or moving transporting wounded out of the combat zone back to rear to field hospitals and what have you. And you can't really achieve most of this if you focus entirely on going towards Tokmak. I mean, if you go through Verbove, you can still in the end attack Tokmak by just going around all the defensives, right? And you can move in to threaten the rear positions of the enemy. You can probably start hunting down artillery locations with Humvees and what have you, once you're through the defensive lines. And you can move up to surround and isolate Polowy. Now, if you focus entirely on Tokmak, going through Robotyne and Novopetrivka, whatever it's called, and heading down southwest, you're going to lose a lot of troops. God damn it. A lot of troops for 18 kilometers achieving this one goal. But if you take Verbove and do hard fighting for 10 kilometers, you can achieve not only one goal, but 4 or 5 goals. So that's why I think Verbove is where Ukraine, will be going in the end. And taking Robotyne and taking Novopetrivka will only be to secure the flank so that Russia can't push in and cut off the Ukrainian troops as they make their push towards Verbove. Right, to finish things off, let's have a look at the Crimean front. Everything is on fire. Na 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 na, as the British so joyfully sang. Kerch Bridge, na 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 na, is, under steady threat, constant threat. Russia has obviously lots of anti-air defenses surrounding that bridge. It's located on the rightmost end of the map here. You can see it says Kerch. And that is the only route via land to reach Crimea from Russia itself. So if you cut that bridge, then you cut vital logistical supplies coming in from Russia to be stored in Crimea to then be shipped north to the front lines. Sorry. The logistical routes north are constantly harassed. You can see 2 explosions marked up at what's it called? Herchesk. Those are 2 roads leading north. There's another one to the west here at Krasnopresk or whatever it's called. And I think that route has been left alone so far, but the other 2, they have been hit with missiles, with bombs, and further north special forces or Ukrainian partisans have attacked the railroads and roads as well. Supply depots and barracks are bombed frequently, steadily, on Crimea and the surrounding area. We have seen video footage of Russian troops doing their daily business at barracks, and then they get targeted by missiles. And so yeah, Ukraine is really bringing the war to Crimea, an area that Russia considers to have always been part of Russia proper, by the way. So to Russia, this is Ukraine striking deep into actual Russian territory, even if Crimea really belongs to Ukraine. So yeah, this is no small thing, these attacks. They're disrupting the logistics, and they are hitting Russian generals, they're killing Russian troops, and they are striking Russian positions in territory that Russia considers to be Russia proper. And then, of course, we have the latest events at Sevastopol with Ukraine beginning to target systematically the Russian Navy and striking warships, submarines, and what have you with drones, despite Elon Musk trying to fuck things up. That little bastard, basically. I was about to say a bunch of horrible stuff, but we'll stick with bastard for now. And the strike at Sevastopol was, as we all know, very successful. They hit a submarine. And what I don't think people, well, the two ships that were struck, that's, obvious, two obvious targets. But what I don't think people realize is that, Russia actually lost two dry docks as well. Two dry docks are out of action because they are now filled with debris and the remains of two broken ships that they can't ship out to sea, right? They're stuck in the dry dock. You can't bring in other ships to repair those until these two damaged ships are fixed. So essentially, the dry docks are out of action. It can't be used by other vessels. And that is the whole point of Russia grabbing Crimea in the first place, because they wanted a deep sea harbor, Sevastopol, right? That's the reason why they took Crimea in the first place. So they could have a deep sea port, Sevastopol, where they could set up a base of operations for their Black Sea fleet, so they could power project into this region of the world, so they could be a threat to Turkey, so they could be a threat to Romania and Greece, so they could move into the Mediterranean and link up with forces in Syria and stuff like that. So Sevastopol and the port and the harbor in Sevastopol is the only reason why Russia went back into Crimea in 2014. So that Ukraine now has struck at Sevastopol and damaged the whole point of the deep sea port, more or less. That's a big win for Ukraine. The port is obviously still in use by the Russian Navy, but the dry docks, they can't use the dry docks anymore. They have to go to other ports to do repairs away from the war. So Ukraine has more or less pushed the Russian Navy back away from Crimea and back east to the Russian mainland. At least as far as repairs are concerned. And I mean, Russian Navy, they know now that they are probably going to get hit by drones and missiles if they stay around Sevastopol. So, I mean, they are probably heading out from Sevastopol as we speak to avoid getting sunk without being able to fight back. Well, that's it for this Armchair General video. That's all I have for you on this topic, the topic of Ukraine and me knowing absolutely nothing about the front line at all.